Male suspect, armed. Possible abduction of a minor in progress. Backup requested now. The words cracked through the police radio like a gunshot in the quiet air. Then came a sound that cut even sharper. A child's scream, high and sudden, echoing off the trees. It was a Saturday morning in Eastover, one of those still, golden mornings where the mist hadn't burned off the lawns yet. Sprinklers ticked in the distance. Somewhere, a dog barked once and went quiet again, as if even the neighborhood knew something was wrong. Before we go any further, tell me where you're watching this from. Drop your city in the comments below, and if stories about justice, truth, and second chances mean something to you, hit that subscribe button right now. It helps more people find stories like this one. Because what you just heard on that radio call was not the truth. It was fear wearing the mask of duty. It was one man's eyes playing tricks on him, turning an ordinary morning into something dark and dangerous, when nothing dangerous was happening at all. A father was about to lose his freedom for the crime of loving his daughter out loud, in public, where the wrong person could see them and decide their bond was a threat. Now let's rewind to how this morning actually began, before the sirens, before the fear, back when it was still just a man and his little girl, and the world hadn't shown its ugliest face yet. The kitchen smelled like butter and warm syrup. Theo stood at the stove, flipping pancakes the way he did every Saturday, letting each one turn golden brown before he slid it onto the plate. Sable sat at the counter, swinging her feet, still in her pajamas, watching him with the kind of trust only a 7-year-old could give. 2 or 3 today? He asked, though he already knew the answer. 3, she said, grinning. I'm growing. He laughed and gave her 3, plus a little extra syrup because it was Saturday, and Saturdays had their own rules. This was their ritual, just the 2 of them, ever since she'd come into his life 4 years ago. No matter how hard the week had been, no matter what he'd seen out in the world, this hour belonged only to pancakes and quiet mornings and Sable's laughter filling the kitchen. After breakfast, they got the bikes out of the garage. Hers was small and pink, with streamers on the handles that danced in the wind. His was plain and steady, built for someone who liked being careful. He knelt down in front of her, the same way he always did, and pulled her helmet strap snug under her chin. Not too tight? He asked. Just right, she said, the same answer she gave every single week. It was a small moment, easy to miss, but it meant everything to him. A promise, repeated quietly, that he would always make sure she was safe. Theo hadn't always lived a life built around pancakes and bike rides. For years, his work had taken him into rooms most people never saw, chasing down men who thought the rules didn't apply to them. He didn't talk about it much, especially not with Sable. To her, he was just Dad, the one who made 3 pancakes instead of 2 and checked her helmet strap twice. They rolled their bikes down the driveway and onto the quiet street, the morning mist still clinging to the grass. Sable pedaled ahead, laughing over her shoulder, and Theo followed close behind, watching her the way he watched everything that mattered most. A block ahead, Officer Trent Ballick sat parked at the curb, one arm resting on his open window, coffee cooling in the cup holder. He'd been watching the street for a few minutes now, more out of habit than anything else. Then he saw them, a tall black man on a bike, and beside him a small girl with blonde curls and pale skin, laughing as she pedaled. Ballick sat up a little straighter. He told himself he was just being thorough, just doing his job, just paying attention the way a good officer should. That was what he told himself. But underneath that thought was something older and quieter, a feeling he never looked at too closely. It was the kind of feeling that turned an ordinary Saturday into a question mark. He started his engine and pulled out slowly, letting his cruiser drift along the curb behind them, keeping pace, not passing. Theo noticed it almost right away. He had spent too many years reading rooms, reading people, reading danger before it had a name, to miss the shift in the air behind him. He glanced in the side mirror of his bike and saw the patrol car crawling along, matching their speed, staying close. His stomach tightened, but his voice stayed calm. "Sable, sweetheart, stay close to me, okay, right beside me." "Why?" she asked, glancing back over her shoulder, her helmet slightly crooked from the wind. "Just because," he said gently. "Sometimes it's good to ride together." She nodded, trusting him the way she always did, and pedaled a little closer, her small pink bike now almost touching his. Theo kept his eyes forward, his hands steady on the handlebars, but his mind was already racing through everything he knew about moments like this. Stay calm, stay visible, don't give anyone a reason. Behind them, the cruiser's engine grew louder. Then, without warning, it swung sharply off the curb and cut across the street, blocking the path ahead of them. Tires crunched against gravel. Theo squeezed his brakes hard, his arm shooting out instinctively to slow Sable beside him, the quiet morning suddenly gone still and sharp, like the air right before a storm breaks. Officer Balak stepped out of his cruiser fast, one hand already resting near his belt. "Stop right there! Hands where I can see them," he called out, his voice sharp and clipped, cutting through the quiet street. Theo raised both hands slowly, keeping his movement steady and easy to read. He had trained himself for moments like this, moments where calm mattered more than anything else. "Good morning, officer," he said, his voice even. "My name is Theo Renard Achebe. This is my daughter, Sable." Balak's eyes moved from Theo's face, down to his hands, then over to Sable, who stood close beside her bike, her small fingers gripping the handlebar. His gaze lingered on her pale skin and the loose blonde curls spilling out from under her helmet. Something shifted behind his eyes, a question forming that he didn't bother to hide. "Is she your daughter?" Balak asked, his tone flat, almost accusing. "Yes, sir," Theo said. "She is." Sable looked up at her father, confused by the tension in the air, then back at the officer standing over them. She didn't understand the question, only that it made her stomach feel funny. Balak studied them both a moment longer, his jaw tight. He didn't ask for proof yet. He didn't need to, not in his own mind. He had already decided something, and now he was only waiting to see if Theo would confirm it or fight it. "Keep your hands where they are," Balak said. "I need to sort this out." "Of course," Theo replied, his voice calm but firm. "We're not going anywhere, but I want you to know, everything here is exactly what it looks like, a father and his daughter, out for a bike ride." Balak didn't answer right away. He simply stared, weighing the sight in front of him against something in his own head that refused to add up the easy way. The morning air, once soft and golden, now felt heavy and still, stretched tight between two very different versions of the same simple truth. Theo moved slowly, keeping one hand raised, while he reached into his jacket pocket with the other. He pulled out a small leather case and opened it, revealing a badge that caught the morning light. "I'm a federal agent," he said calmly. "DEA. This is my identification." He held it steady, not stepping forward, not raising his voice. Then, with his other hand, he took out a folded set of papers from the small bag clipped to his bike. "And this is Sable's adoption record. Everything is legal. Everything is documented. You're welcome to call it in and confirm." Balik took a step closer, his eyes flicking over the badge without really studying it. His expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened further, as if the proof in front of him only sharpened whatever question he'd already answered in his own mind. "Anybody can print a badge these days," Balik said, his voice flat with dismissal. "Doesn't mean much to me." Theo felt the words land like a slap, but he didn't argue. He didn't repeat himself, or raise his badge higher, or beg to be believed. He simply lowered his hand slightly and said, "You can call my office. Verify it yourself. The number's right there." Balik didn't reach for his radio. He didn't glance at the papers again either. Instead, he stood there, arms crossed, letting the silence stretch out, as if waiting for Theo to crack under the weight of it. Sable looked between them, sensing something was wrong even if she didn't understand the words. She reached for her father's leg, her small fingers curling into the fabric of his jeans. Theo felt her touch and steadied himself, keeping his voice gentle even as his heart pounded harder beneath his calm exterior. "Officer, I've shown you everything you need. There's no reason for this to go any further." Balik's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. He simply turned toward his cruiser, one hand resting on his radio, his silence somehow louder than any accusation he could have spoken aloud. Across the street, Odell Frazier stood in his front yard, hose in hand, watering the hydrangeas he'd grown for almost 20 years. He was 70 years old, retired now, but he still woke early out of habit, still liked the quiet of a Saturday morning before the rest of the world caught up to him. He noticed the flashing lights first, then the raised voices carrying across the lawns. He set the hose down slowly, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. A man with his hands raised, a little girl clutching his leg, an officer standing rigid, radio in hand. Something about it didn't sit right in Odell's chest. Without much thought, he pulled his phone from his shirt pocket and pressed record, almost absent-mindedly, the way a person reaches for an umbrella when the sky looks wrong. He didn't announce it, he didn't step closer, he just stood there, phone raised, capturing everything as it unfolded. "This is Eastover Road," he murmured under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. Man's just standing there with his hands up, little girls crying. Behind Balik, a second patrol car rounded the corner, lights spinning, and pulled up fast behind the first. The engine cut off, and a younger officer stepped out, adjusting his belt as he approached. "What do we have?" the second officer asked, glancing between Theo and the girl. "Possible false ID," Balik said, not taking his eyes off Theo. "Says he's a federal agent. The kid doesn't match." The new officer's eyebrows rose slightly, but he said nothing, taking his place beside Balik instead, arms crossed, mirroring his stance. Theo felt the shift immediately, the way two officers standing together carried more weight than one, the way the street suddenly felt smaller, tighter, harder to breathe in. Sable pressed closer against him, her small shoulders shaking. Odell kept recording, his hand steady despite the growing tension in his chest. Something told him this moment mattered, that somebody, somewhere, would need to see exactly what happened next on this quiet street that no longer felt quiet at all. Balik unclipped the handcuffs from his belt, the metal catching a glint of morning light. Theo saw the motion and kept his hands raised, his voice low and even. "Officer, think carefully about what you're about to do. You're about to detain a federal officer in front of his own child with no real cause." That's not a small mistake. That's a costly one. Turn around, Balik said, ignoring him. Hands behind your back. I am not resisting, Theo said, his tone still steady, still calm. But I need you to understand exactly what's happening here, for your own sake. Turn around, Balik repeated, his voice harder now, edged with something close to impatience. Theo turned slowly, his heart hammering beneath his ribs, though nothing on his face showed it. Inside, his thoughts raced, sharp and fast. This is wrong. This is happening anyway. Stay calm. Do not give him a reason. Sable is watching. Outside, he remained still, his shoulders relaxed, his breathing measured, every part of him fighting to look like a man in control, even as the cuffs clicked shut around his wrists. "Daddy!" Sable's voice cracked behind him, small and frightened. "It's all right, sweetheart," Theo said, turning his head slightly toward her, keeping his voice gentle despite everything. "Just stay where you are. Count with me. 1, 2. The second officer stepped closer to Sable, though he didn't touch her yet, simply hovering near her shoulder. She flinched away from him, moving closer to her father instead. "Sir," Theo said, addressing Balik directly now, his voice quieter but firmer. "There is still time to stop this. One phone call would end it. My daughter does not need to see the rest of this." Balik didn't answer. He tightened the cuffs instead, his jaw locked, his eyes refusing to meet Theo's. Odell, still recording from across the street, lowered his phone slightly and whispered, "Lord, help this family," before raising it again, steady, watching, unwilling to look away from whatever was about to happen next on that quiet, sunlit street. Sable couldn't hold still any longer. She broke free from where she stood and ran toward her father, her small arms reaching for him. "Daddy, no, leave him alone." Balik turned sharply at the sudden movement, his arm swinging out on instinct rather than thought. It caught Sable across the shoulder, just enough to knock her off balance. She stumbled sideways and fell hard onto the curb, her palm scraping against the rough concrete. A sharp cry burst out of her, high and startled, as blood welled up in thin lines across her skin. For a moment, everything on the street seemed to freeze. Theo's whole body went rigid, the calm he had been holding on to finally cracking under the weight of what he'd just seen. His voice, when it came, was low and shaking with something far more dangerous than anger. "You just hurt the one person I've sworn my whole life to protect." The words hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable, carrying further than his usual measured tone ever had. Balik froze, glancing down at Sable, who now sat on the ground clutching her scraped palm, tears streaming down her face. For just a second, something flickered across his face, not quite guilt, but not quite nothing either. "She ran at me," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "I didn't mean—" "She's 7, Theo said, cutting him off, his voice trembling now, though his hands stayed cuffed and still behind his back. "She's 7 years old, and she's bleeding because you couldn't stop to think for 1 second. Odell, still filming from across the street, lowered his phone just slightly, his own hands shaking now. "He shoved that baby," he muttered, disbelief thick in his voice. "He shoved her right into the curb." Sable sobbed harder, reaching one arm toward her father, even as the second officer knelt beside her, unsure what to do with his hands. "Daddy," she cried. "It hurts." "I know, baby," Theo said, his voice breaking for the first time all morning. "I know. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." A third patrol car pulled up fast, tires bumping against the curb. Officer Priya Achterberg stepped out, her eyes scanning the scene quickly, the crying girl on the ground, the man in handcuffs, the small crowd now watching from their porches. Then her gaze landed on Theo's face, and something shifted in her expression. "Wait," she said, walking closer. "I know him. That's Agent Renard Achebe. He ran a briefing for our task force back in the spring. He's DEA. Balik glanced at her, his jaw tight. "He says that badges could be fake." "It's not fake," Priya said, her voice firm now, stepping between Balik and the scene. "I sat in his training for 3 hours. I'd know his face anywhere. Take the cuffs off." Balik shook his head, planting his feet like a man who had already decided the shape of the story and wasn't ready to let it change. "I've got this handled," he said. "Let me finish the report." "There's nothing to finish," Priya shot back. "You're holding a federal agent, and his daughter is bleeding on the ground. This isn't handled. This is out of control." "I said I've got it," Balik repeated, sharper this time, his tone leaving no room for argument. Priya hesitated, glancing at Sable, then at Theo's calm, tight expression, then back at Balik's stubborn refusal to listen. For a moment, she looked like she might push harder. Instead, she stepped back, though her face made it clear she wasn't finished, not by a long way. That hesitation, that choice to dig in instead of listen, was the moment everything changed. Up until now, it might have been called a misunderstanding, a mistake made too quickly and never corrected. But now, with someone standing right there, telling him the truth, and Balik choosing to ignore it anyway, it became something else entirely. A decision. One he was making with his eyes wide open. Theo watched it all happen, his jaw tight, his daughter's blood still drying on her palm. He said nothing more. He simply waited, knowing now that whatever came next would not be an accident. The low growl of engines rolled down the street before anyone saw them coming. 3 black SUVs turned the corner fast, tires gripping the pavement, and screeched to a stop just short of the patrol cars. Doors flew open in unison, radios crackled, boots hit the pavement hard, moving with purpose. Special Agent in Charge Yolanda Spate stepped out first, her badge already raised, her eyes sweeping the scene in one sharp motion, taking in the cuffed man, the crying child, the scraped palm, the small crowd of neighbors gathered along the sidewalk. "Who authorized this detention?" she called out, her voice cutting clean through the noise of the street, carrying an authority that made even the onlookers go quiet. Balik straightened, his hand instinctively brushing his belt. "Ma'am, I stopped a man matching a—" "I asked who authorized it," Spate said again, stepping closer, her tone leaving no space for excuses. "Not what you thought you saw. Who gave you the right to put cuffs on a federal officer and let his daughter bleed on the sidewalk?" Balik opened his mouth, then closed it, his confidence draining fast under the weight of her stare. I was following procedure," he managed finally, the words stumbling out weaker than he meant them to sound. "Procedure," Spate repeated flatly, glancing at Sable, who sat wrapped in a blanket one of the agents had already draped over her shoulders. "This does not look like procedure to me, officer. This looks like a mistake that is about to cost you everything." She turned to Theo, her expression softening only slightly. "Agent Renard Achebe, are you hurt?" "I'm fine," Theo said quietly. "Sable needs a doctor." "She'll have one in minutes," Spate said, already motioning for one of her agents to check on the girl. Then she turned back to Balik, her voice dropping low and cold. "Uncuff him, now." Balik fumbled for his keys, his hands no longer steady, the same hands that had clicked the cuffs shut with such certainty only minutes earlier. The metallic click of their opening seemed impossibly loud in the sudden quiet of the street. Every neighbor, every phone, every breath seeming to pause and wait for what would happen next. A department cruiser pulled up moments later, and Sergeant Corbin Vasquez stepped out, his expression grim as he took in the scene before him. He had heard the call come through, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of a bleeding child, a shaken federal agent, and Balik standing frozen near his cruiser, his cuffs already hanging open in Theo's hands. Vasquez walked straight up to him, his voice low but firm enough to carry. "Badge and weapons. Now." Balik blinked, as if the words hadn't quite landed. "Sergeant, I was protecting the girl. I thought—" "I don't need what you thought," Vasquez said, cutting him off. "I need your badge and your weapon, right here, right now." The small crowd along the sidewalk had grown, neighbors stepping closer, murmurs rippling through them. Someone whispered, "They're taking his badge right there in the street." Another voice answered, low but sharp, "Good. About time." Balik's hands moved slowly, almost reluctantly, unclipping the badge from his chest. He held it out, his fingers trembling slightly. "I was doing my job," he said again, quieter this time, as if trying the words on to see if they still fit. "Your job was to verify, not assume," Vasquez said, taking the badge and slipping it into an evidence bag one of the agents held open. "You had proof in your hands, and you chose not to believe it. That's not protecting anyone. That's a choice you made." Next came the weapon, unclipped and handed over just as slowly, the holster now empty at Balik's side. He stood there afterward, stripped of both, looking somehow smaller than he had all morning, his shoulders sagging under the weight of every eye now fixed on him. Vasquez turned to the crowd briefly, his voice calm but clear. "This officer is suspended, effective immediately, pending a full investigation." Odell lowered his phone slightly, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Across the street, Theo knelt beside Sable, one hand smoothing her hair, the other still trembling faintly from everything that had just happened, though his eyes stayed fixed on his daughter, and only his daughter, as if nothing else in the world mattered anymore. An ambulance rolled up quietly, its lights turning without the siren, and two paramedics stepped out with steady, practiced calm. One knelt beside Sable, gently taking her scraped palm in gloved hands, cleaning it with a soft wipe before wrapping it in gauze. "You're being so brave," the paramedic said softly, smiling at her. Sable sniffled, watching her bandaged hand as if it belonged to someone else. "Does it look bad?" "Not anymore," the paramedic said. "You're going to be just fine." The second paramedic turned to Theo, gently taking each of his wrists and checking them, pressing lightly along the skin where the cuffs had left faint red marks. "Any pain here? Numbness?" "I'm all right," Theo said quietly, though his eyes never left Sable, watching her small hand disappear beneath the white gauze. Odell crossed the street slowly, his phone still in his hand. The recording finally stopped. He approached Theo with a careful, respectful distance, unsure if he should speak at all. "Sir," he said gently, "I got it all, every second of it. I didn't know what else to do, so I just kept recording." Theo looked up at him, something like gratitude flickering across his tired face. "You did exactly the right thing," he said. "Thank you." Odell nodded, glancing down at Sable. "How's the little one holding up?" "She's tough," Theo said, his voice softening as he brushed a curl away from her forehead. "Tougher than she should have to be." Sable looked up between them, her tears finally slowing, her small fingers curling gently around her father's hand instead of pulling away from the world around her. "Can we go home now?" she asked. "Soon, sweetheart," Theo said, "very soon." Behind them, unnoticed at first, Odell's phone buzzed once, then again, notifications stacking up fast as the video he'd posted only minutes earlier began spreading further than he ever expected. He glanced down at the screen, his eyebrows lifting in quiet surprise. Whatever had happened that morning on this quiet street was no longer just theirs. It belonged to everyone watching now, and by nightfall, it would belong to the whole country. By early afternoon, Odell's video had reached numbers none of them could have imagined. What started as a quiet recording from a front yard in Eastover was now playing on screens across the country. News stations picked it up within hours, running the footage on a loop, freezing on the moment Sable hit the curb, then again on the moment the cuffs came off Theo's wrists. Headlines stacked up fast, one after another. Federal agent handcuffed in front of daughter during bike ride. Charlotte officer suspended after child injured in wrongful stop. Body cam footage shows the agent's credentials ignored, dismissed on the spot. Each one carried the story a little further, reaching people who had never heard of Eastover Road until that morning. By late afternoon, Chief Patricia Yoon stood before a small group of reporters outside police headquarters, her expression tight, her words chosen carefully. "The footage from this morning's incident is deeply troubling," she said. "We take full responsibility for reviewing every detail of what happened, and we will not tolerate conduct that harms the very community we are sworn to protect." Reporters shouted questions, but she held up a hand, calm and steady. "Officer Balik has been placed on administrative leave, effective immediately, pending a full internal investigation. That investigation will be thorough and it will be public." By evening, the mayor's office released its own statement, shorter but just as firm. It called the incident unacceptable and promised full cooperation with any outside review the family might request. Local council members began speaking out too, some calling for immediate policy changes, others demanding more transparency around past complaints filed against officers still working the streets. Across the city, people who had never met Theo or Sable found themselves talking about them anyway, sharing the video, arguing in comment sections, asking the same question over and over. How does this keep happening? At home that evening, Theo sat quietly, with Sable curled against his side, her bandaged hand resting in her lap, the television murmuring softly in the background. He didn't need the news to tell him what had happened, but even he could feel it now, the sense that this day was only the beginning of something much larger than either of them had expected. 2 days later, Balik sat across from Sergeant Vasquez in a small grey interview room at Internal Affairs. A single folder lay on the table between them, thick with paper, edges worn from handling. Balik's uniform was gone now, replaced by a plain collared shirt that made him look smaller than he had on the street. Vasquez opened the folder slowly, flipping through pages without looking up right away. "You want to tell me about these?" he asked. "About what?" Balik said, though his eyes had already dropped to the papers. 7 complaints, Vasquez said. Over 4 years, all profiling, all dismissed quietly, one way or another. He turned the folder around so Balik could see the names, the dates, the short summaries typed beneath each one. "You want to explain that to me?" Balik shifted in his seat. Those were cleared, every one of them. Nothing ever stuck. Nothing ever stuck because nobody looked hard enough, Vasquez said. Until now. Silence settled over the room for a moment. Balik stared down at his hands, his jaw working like he wanted to argue, but couldn't quite find the words. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he finally said, his voice quieter than before. "Not really. I don't know. I saw something and I reacted. You've been reacting the same way for years, Vasquez said. That's the part you're missing. This wasn't one bad morning. This was a pattern finally catching up to you. Balik's hands tightened together on the table, his knuckles pale. For the first time since the interview began, something like real regret flickered across his face, quick and uncertain, gone almost as soon as it appeared. Vasquez closed the folder and leaned back in his chair, his voice steady and final. You didn't make one mistake, Officer Balik. You made a habit of one. And this time, it landed on a man who had the badge and the resources to make sure it couldn't be buried again. Balik said nothing. He simply stared at the closed folder, as if 7 complaints and one Saturday morning had finally added up to a number even he could no longer explain away. 7 months later, the courthouse in downtown Charlotte stood packed to its limits. News vans lined the street outside, satellite dishes tilted toward the sky, reporters speaking quietly into cameras before the doors even opened. What had started as one family's ordinary Saturday had become a case the whole country was watching. Inside, the courtroom filled quickly, every seat taken, every hallway lined with people hoping for a glimpse of the trial everyone had heard about. The air felt heavy, thick with the kind of attention that made even seasoned lawyers straighten their ties a little tighter than usual. At the plaintiff's table sat attorney Bianca Ferro, her presence calm but unmistakably sharp, the kind of lawyer who never raised her voice because she never needed to. She arranged her files with quiet precision, each paper squared perfectly against the last, her focus entirely on the case in front of her. Across the aisle, defense attorney Holt Sanborn adjusted his glasses as he reviewed his notes one final time, his manner polished but noticeably tense. A man used to winning arguments, now facing one he seemed to already sense slipping away from him. Theo sat beside Ferro, dressed simply, his expression steady despite the weight of every eye in the room. Sable was not present today, kept instead in a quiet room down the hall with a counselor, away from the cameras and noise that still made her flinch sometimes at loud voices. At exactly 9 o'clock, the bailiff called the room to order, and Judge Miriam Castellano entered, her expression calm but firm, carrying the quiet authority of someone who had presided over difficult cases before, though perhaps none quite like this one. This court is now in session, she said, her voice carrying easily across the silent room. We are here for the case of Renard Achebe versus the City of Charlotte and Officer Trent Balik. Counsel, you may proceed. Ferro rose first, smoothing her jacket before stepping toward the jury, her voice steady and clear as she prepared to speak the words that would frame everything the room was about to hear. Bianca Ferro stood before the jury, her voice calm but carrying to every corner of the room. This case, she said, is about what happens when prejudice wears a badge. She let the words settle before continuing. A father showed proof of who he was. A daughter showed nothing but love for the man who raised her, and still, both of them were treated like a threat, simply because of how they looked standing side by side. Officer Priya Achterberg took the stand first, her testimony steady and clear. I recognized Agent Renard Achebe immediately, she said. I told Officer Balik who he was. I asked him to remove the cuffs. He told me he had it handled. She paused. He didn't have it handled. He had already decided not to listen. Odell Frazier testified next, his voice a little unsteady, but honest. I've lived on that street for 20 years, he said. Never seen anything like it. That officer pushed a little girl clean onto the curb. I got it all on my phone, every second. When Holt Sanborn rose to cross-examine, he tried to steady the ground beneath his case, suggesting confusion, poor visibility, a split-second decision made under pressure. But each question seemed to sink a little further, instead of lifting his argument higher. Finally, Ferro called Balik himself to the stand. She let him explain his reasoning, his hesitation, his so-called instincts. Then, quietly, she reminded the jury of his own words from that morning. "You told Agent Renard Achebe that anybody can print a badge these days," she said. "Do you remember saying that?" Balik shifted in his seat. Yes, I said that." Ferro nodded slowly, then turned toward the jury before delivering her final line. "Anybody can print a badge," she repeated, "but only one man in this room owns the truth. And it was never you, Officer Balik." The courtroom stayed silent for a long moment afterward, the weight of her words settling over jurors and spectators alike, the kind of silence that made it clear the case had already tipped, long before anyone reached a verdict. The jury returned late in the afternoon, filing back into the courtroom in silence, their faces giving nothing away. Judge Castellano waited until everyone had settled before speaking. As the jury reached a verdict, the foreperson stood, a single sheet of paper steady in her hands. "We have, Your Honor." "Please read it aloud." "In the case of Renard Achebe versus the City of Charlotte and Officer Trent Balik," she began, "we find in favor of the plaintiff. We award damages in the total amount of $9.5 million. A quiet murmur swept through the gallery, quickly hushed as the foreperson continued. $6.5 million to Special Agent Theo Renard Achebe for wrongful detention, physical harm, and emotional distress. $3 million to be placed in trust for Sable Hendricks for medical care and future needs. Judge Castellano nodded once, her voice firm as she turned toward Balik. "In addition to these damages, this court orders that Officer Trent Balik be entered into the state's decertification registry, effective immediately. He is permanently barred from serving in law enforcement in this state." Balik stared straight ahead, his face pale, his hands folded tightly in his lap. He said nothing. At the plaintiff's table, Theo sat still, the number settling over him slowly, like something distant and hard to fully grasp. There was no smile on his face, no triumphant exhale, just a quiet nod and a long breath released through his nose. Ferro leaned toward him. "You did this," she said softly, "for her." Theo glanced toward the hallway where Sable waited with her counselor, unaware yet of the number attached to her name, only aware that today marked the end of something long and difficult. "It was never about the money," he said quietly. "It was about making sure nobody looks at her the way he did and gets away with it." Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions as he stepped out into the afternoon light, cameras flashing all around him. He said only a few words before walking on. "Today the truth was heard. That's all I ever wanted." In the weeks following the verdict, Charlotte's police department began rolling out changes that reached far beyond one officer or one street. Chief Patricia Yoon announced that every officer in the department would complete 40 hours of bias awareness training, no exceptions, no delays. Classes filled quickly, some officers signing up on their own, others required to attend as part of the department's new policy. Body cameras, once optional in certain situations, became mandatory for any stop involving a minor. Dashboard footage was reviewed weekly instead of only when a complaint was filed. A new oversight board was formed, made up of community members and retired officers, tasked with reviewing profiling complaints within days, instead of letting them sit buried in files for years. Reporters covered the changes closely, noting that within the first month, more than 800 officers had already completed the new training. Community meetings were held in church basements and school gymnasiums, where residents spoke openly for the first time about stops they had never reported, moments they had carried quietly for years. Across town, in a warehouse just outside the city limits, Trent Ballock clocked in for another overnight shift, his name tag reading nothing more than his last name stitched in plain thread. He pushed pallets across the concrete floor under humming fluorescent lights, his old uniform folded somewhere in a closet he no longer opened. No badge hung at his hip now, only a key card clipped to his belt loop, letting him in and out of a building where nobody knew or cared who he used to be. He kept his head down most nights, rarely speaking beyond what the job required. Once, a co-worker mentioned a viral video they'd seen months back, a cop and a little girl and a curb, laughing about how crazy people could be. Ballock said nothing, simply nodded and kept moving pallets, the weight of the boxes far lighter than the weight he carried home with him every night. The department moved forward, one training session at a time, one policy at a time, each small change a quiet promise that what happened on Eastover Road would not simply be forgotten once the cameras stopped rolling. 1 year after that morning on Eastover Road, Theo stood in a small office above a bakery, the walls still bare except for one framed photo, Sable's bandaged hand resting in his on the day of the verdict. The sign on the door outside read simply, "Bridges Foundation, helping families like his own find their footing after moments the world never should have put them through." He had spent the past months building it slowly, one conversation at a time, working with mixed-race families and adoptive parents who carried their own quiet fears about ordinary trips to the park or the grocery store. Volunteers answered phones in the next room, connecting families with lawyers, counselors, and officers willing to listen and learn instead of assume. It wasn't a large operation yet, but it was steady, growing a little more each week. On Saturday morning, the pancakes were back on the stove, 3 instead of 2, syrup poured a little heavier than usual because it was still their tradition, still theirs alone. Sable sat at the counter, taller now, her scraped palm long since healed, though the memory of it still surfaced sometimes, in quiet moments neither of them spoke about out loud. After breakfast, they wheeled their bikes down the driveway again, the same as always. Theo knelt in front of her, pulling her helmet strap snug beneath her chin, the same motion he'd repeated every week for years. "Not too tight?" he asked. "Just right," she said, smiling the same way she always had. He stood, watching her pedal ahead down the quiet street, sunlight spilling gently across the pavement where, 1 year earlier, everything had nearly fallen apart. This time, the street stayed calm. This time, nothing stopped them. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories about truth, justice, and the families still fighting for both.